Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about junior, mid-levels and seniors, so let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, how do you spot the difference between a junior, mid-level and senior level software developer? I ask them a experience question usually. That is how I do it. So the way that I find it easiest to figure out a person's level is to just ask a few select questions related to their experiences working with different tools or facing different challenges within IT. And usually when you do that, it's fairly easy to figure out based on the wisdom and considerations that they put into their answer. You can sort of hear their level of understanding of how to do something. So an example would be if you ask, say, a junior software developer, can you explain to me what is the most difficult thing in software development? Usually they will give you a very shallow, simple answer, like, oh, unit testing is pretty hard, and sometimes it's hard to understand how to do things, etc., etc. Whereas a mid-level might talk about higher level concepts because they've sort of progressed above the coding problems of the day-to-day, right? They might say something like, oh, it's really hard to get the right stakeholder information, and sometimes it's hard with third-party dependencies, or etc., etc. And senior level developers, they usually have the same sort of answer, but they have more experience to draw upon. So the reason why I like these sorts of questions is because they can't be faked. The downside with them is that you yourself have to know what the answer should be, or well, not what it should be. I hope you understand what I'm saying, but you have to know yourself what a real answer sounds like. And I've had many conversations with senior software developers, or quote-unquote senior software developers, who are just awful at what they do. They can speak with confidence, but I can also tell that they don't actually know what they're talking about whatsoever, and they might be able to trick somebody who knows nothing, like an HR person or something like that, but they're not going to trick like a serious software developer, because we can some people mistake experience for charisma and confidence, and that's charisma and confidence usually comes with years of experience, because if you, as some people might have realized, if you spend enough time doing something, thinking that you're good at that thing, in your head you are equal to those who are really good, and you've gone through the same confidence development. It's just that you don't realize, because if you meet someone who's, as I made the statement a while back, if you spend your entire life playing around in a little pond, well, then it's no wonder that you don't know what it means to swim in the ocean. And it's only when you meet someone who swam in the ocean you start to realize that, oh shit, there's more to this thing than what I've been doing. And I meet these people all the time. I interview many senior software developers who have the ability to get a job working on usually low-end projects, or for companies who don't really know or care about what quality software development looks like, but they are never gonna get into like the major IT companies, or the sort of companies where they actually know what a good software developer looks like, because they simply don't have those skills, but they believe they do. And that's why it's so fun, or well, fun is a strong word, but it's usually very effective to just ask them about their experiences, because even they will usually not be able to go into any meaningful detail about their different experiences. They will usually keep their answers very vague and very shallow, just as a junior or a mid-level who is a little bit unsure. The real seniors will be able to draw upon concrete experiences where, so as an example, let's say my favorite one is, one of my favorites is, can you explain the different types of CSS styles that you have been using in your different projects, and when does one make more sense than the other. As an example, when do you use CSS in JS, and when do you use Sass, when do you use just vanilla CSS, and when do you use something like just adding things to a style, to the style attribute. Now, no one who hasn't done extensive work for years on multiple projects will be able to answer that question. A junior will never know that, because they have most likely just learned the thing that is easiest to learn at the early days. And that's depending on like where you are. Let's say that you work in React or Angular or something like that. That's probably going to be something like style components or CSS in JS solutions. Or if you had a different stack, you're probably going to use CSS in CSS modules or SCSS or something like that, because these are like the standard. This is the beginner level stuff. You just use that thing, and then you have your CSS, because your focus is to learn how to work overall. Your focus is not to like you haven't worked enough to try different approaches to the same sort of problem and looked at what works and what doesn't work. A mid-level might know one or two because they have done a little bit more living, so they might have tried out both SCSS and also CSS and JS, and then they might say something arbitrary like, oh yeah, I like I like SCSS better because I think it makes writing CSS more elegant. You can like make it cleaner in the file because you can use like inheritance and stuff. Or they might say something like CSS in JS is nicer because you can like use the type system and you can like declare variables and things like that. And these are valid answers. And a senior software developer might go and say something like that. Well, usually I go with the thing that is probably going to be most stable, because some of the frameworks that you use are more favorable, like they're easier to use if you use something like CSS in JS. And then I also look at the overall project. If we say have an established code base that uses something like SCSS, it's probably a good idea to stick with that, even though we could probably tweak it a little bit. So we might use CSS modules in that scenario, simply because if we are working with people who, if we don't have a convention of naming, we actually get the problem with name collisions and so forth, and that can be an issue with scalability. And it's also very good to remember that a lot of developers in frontend, for example, they're not so good with CSS. Most developers are actually not that great with it, so it's really good to try to pick something that, unless you have something very specific to deal with, like with the style tags, you want to pick something that is not going to cause a lot of issues for developers, because you don't want to go back to the old days where people used like IDs and very specific selectors to try to scale their CSS. This is where like the problems come, because undoing bad CSS is actually a lot harder than just adding new CSS, which is a different sort of problem. And in that scenario, it might be better to use something that feels very mainstream and sort of approachable to the people working in the stack. So in React, that would probably be something like emotion or style components or something like that. But in a different sort of project, it might be something different. It's more about in that, because CSS, although it has an impact, is not as important as the scalability of the work process for the people dealing with it. The one exception I like to make to this is when you're doing something where you might want to create a widget or a third-party library or something like that. In that scenario, it's probably better to reduce the amount of overall dependencies a person needs, because if you you can of course ship your package with like a CSS file or a CSS in JS solution, but unless you're using like media queries or these sort of more like the features that are necessary for you to in order to leverage media queries and so forth, you sort of have to use a more sophisticated solution. But especially if you're going to use something like a widget or something where you don't know in what environment is this thing gonna work, it's actually nicer for you to just use a style tag, like you just inline the style, because you're going to get the best specificity, and you can put that into a hostile work environment, or like a hostile where you don't know what type of like styles are on the page, and feel very comfortable in that thing is probably going to stay styled the way that you intended. So that's not a perfect explanation, but I hope that you can see sort of what I'm talking about. Those sorts of experiences, you would never be able to talk like that unless you've done it. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I spot the difference between a junior, mid-level, or senior, or like of different experience levels, is that you ask them experience questions. You ask them to reflect a bit or like share their thoughts on a topic. Doesn't matter what topic it is, and then you usually ask a few of them on different areas, because some people work with some things and some people work with, a senior level software developer. You can ask that person about something they never worked with, and they're not going to be able to say much about it. But usually you just like do these samples across the stack and just find something where they can relate, and you ask. And it's the same thing with junior and mid-level software developers. And then you just look at what is the depth of their understanding of this thing, and how shallow is the answer, or how deep is the answer, is the thing that usually that I use in order to figure out their skill level. This works flawlessly, and it's practically impossible to fake, I would say. Have a great day.